There are three names that still make hip-hop go quiet. Biggie, Nipsey, Tupac. On August 5th, 2026, Rick Ross looked into the camera and aimed a joke at the loudest of those ghosts. Rick Ross said Tupac has been gone 30 years and told the culture to let Tupac rest. Rick Ross aimed that line at 50 Cent after 50 Cent teased a record built from unreleased Tupac vocals and an Eminem verse. The timeline did not laugh first. The timeline froze first. Then the timeline caught fire. This is not another Rick Ross versus 50 Cent rerun. This is not a meme recap. This is the night Rick Ross confused a punchline with a permission slip. Because when 50 Cent put Tupac and Eminem in the same sentence, 50 Cent was not teasing a song. 50 Cent was opening a vault. And Rick Ross, instead of knocking on the vault, Rick Ross slapped the door and told the dead man inside to stop making noise. Stay with his breakdown, because the real story is not the insult. The real story is consent. Who gets to speak for Tupac in 2026? Who gets to profit from Tupac in 2026? Who gets to protect Tupac in 2026? Rick Ross asked whether posthumous features honor the legacy or rob the estate. That question is fair. That question is old. That question has been argued since the first unfinished verse got dragged into a studio after the funeral. But Rick Ross did not ask that question like a guardian. Rick Ross asked that question like a heckler. And hip-hop can forgive a hard question. Hip-hop does not forgive a smirk aimed at a sacred name. Here is the setup. 50 Cent teased a record with the calm of a man holding four aces. No rant, no paragraph, no desperate caption. Just the announcement that unreleased Tupac vocals and an Eminem verse were moving toward the same beat. That combination is not music news. That combination is a cultural earthquake. Tupac is a martyr. Eminem is a technician. 50 Cent is a survivor who turned beef into boardrooms. Rick Ross saw the announcement and moved fast. Because Rick Ross understands one rule of the modern timeline. Attention goes to the first person willing to say the reckless thing with confidence. Rick Ross said the reckless thing. Rick Ross said Pac has been dead 30 years. Rick Ross said let the man rest. On paper, the sentence sounds reasonable. In the culture, the sentence landed like a bottle thrown at a memorial wall. Because Tupac is not a normal catalog. Tupac is not a normal headline. Tupac is the name mothers still say with a lowered voice. Tupac is a name that turns a cookout argument into church. Rick Ross knew that. Rick Ross has built a career on knowing exactly where the third rail is and touching the third rail with a smile. The first mistake was timing. Rick Ross did not raise the ethics of posthumous music during a quiet panel. Rick Ross raised the ethics in the middle of a beef at the exact moment 50 Cent had the culture leaning forward. That made the question look less like concern and more like sabotage. The second mistake was tone. Rick Ross did not sound protective. Rick Ross sounded entertained. The third mistake was target selection. Rick Ross did not challenge the label, the estate, the sample clearance, the producer, or the business model. Rick Ross aimed at Tupac directly, as if Tupac was an active rapper ducking a fade instead of a legend whose voice keeps getting summoned by the living. Now watch the genius move. 50 Cent did not respond with a diss. 50 Cent did not give Rick Ross the back and forth Rick Ross wanted. 50 Cent posted the Eminem and Tupac teaser again with no caption, no emoji, no insult, no explanation, just audio. That silence was louder than 100 tweets. Because when the room already knows the names on a record, extra words look insecure. 50 Cent let the teaser breathe. 50 Cent let the culture argue under the post. 50 Cent let Rick Ross become the only person in the room, still talking while everybody else was listening. That is the part the casual fan missed. Rick Ross was fighting for the joke. 50 Cent was fighting for jurisdiction. A joke wins the first hour. Jurisdiction wins a month. Rick Ross got the quick clip, the quick laugh, the quick repost. 50 Cent got the frame. And the frame is everything. By refusing to explain, 50 Cent made the record feel bigger than Rick Ross, bigger than the beef, bigger than the timeline. 50 Cent turned a teaser into a referendum. Either the culture believes Tupac can still be presented with care, or the culture believes every unreleased vocal is a grave robbery with a hook. Rick Ross walked into that referendum with the wrong energy. Rick Ross treated the moment like a roast battle. But Tupac changes the physics of a roast battle. A joke about Rick Ross lands on Rick Ross. A joke about 50 Cent lands on 50 Cent. A joke about Tupac lands on everybody who ever needed Tupac to survive a summer, a sentence, a funeral, a betrayal, a night when the world felt rigged. That is why the backlash moved faster than the usual stand war. This was not Team Rick Ross against Team 50 Cent. This became Rick Ross against memory itself. Let the record be fair. Rick Ross was not inventing concern. Posthumous rap has a real problem. Labels have polished leftovers into singles that the artist never approved. Estates have signed off on holograms, commercials, features, and festival tricks that would make the living artist flinch. Fans have bought the package because grief makes people hungry for one more verse. So when Rick Ross says, "Let Tupac rest," there's a version of that sentence that could have sounded like protection. There's a version where Rick Ross calls out the machinery around the music. There's a version where Rick Ross asks 50 Cent whether the Shakur family blessed the session, whether the vocals were handled with care, whether the record adds to the legacy or just rents the legacy for a weekend. Rick Ross did not choose that version. Rick Ross chose the drive-by version. Short, mocking, built for clips. And because Rick Ross chose the drive-by version, the valid question got buried under the disrespect. That is a tragedy inside the comedy. A real debate about consent got turned into a caption war. A real concern about estates got flattened into a meme. Rick Ross had a lane and missed a lane. Rick Ross could have sounded like the adult in the room. Instead, Rick Ross sounded like the man trying to turn a vigil into a comedy club. The culture reacted in layers. The first layer was pure shock. Not because Rick Ross is above disrespect, but because certain names still carry a force field. Biggie has that force field. Nipsey has that force field. Tupac has the strongest force field of all. The second layer was suspicion. Fans started asking why Rick Ross chose that exact moment to care about rest. The third layer was memory. Old clips came back. Old interviews came back. Old verses came back. The timeline started comparing every Rick Ross luxury line against every Tupac wound. Once that comparison starts, the luxury loses. This is where the beef stops being funny. Rick Ross did not just pick a fight with 50 Cent. Rick Ross picked a fight with the Shakur family, with the estate lawyers, with the purists, with the West Coast elders, with the Midwest poets, with the Southern writers who still play Tupac at repast dinners, with every fan who believes some names are not content. Rick Ross also handed 50 Cent the one thing 50 Cent has spent 20 years building: moral position. 50 Cent has been the villain, the bully, the troll, the executive, the survivor, the marketer. But in this exchange, 50 Cent became the keeper of the flame without saying a single defensive word. Understand how rare that is. 50 Cent did not have to argue that the record is respectful. 50 Cent did not have to prove the vocals are cleared. 50 Cent did not have to explain the Eminem verse. The absence of explanation became the argument. The teaser said this is sacred. The repost said this is still sacred. The silence said Rick Ross is not important enough to interrupt the ceremony. That is psychological warfare at the highest level. Rick Ross brought a joke to a ritual, and 50 Cent simply lowered the lights. There is also a business layer hiding under the emotion. A Tupac and Eminem record in 2026 is not just a song. That record is a streaming event, a documentary hook, a licensing magnet, a vinyl moment, a think piece factory, a legacy checkpoint. Whoever controls the narrative around that record controls the first week, the second week, the anniversary content, the sync conversations, the museum language. Rick Ross tried to reduce that event to a corpse joke. 50 Cent answered by making the event feel untouchable. One man attacked the product. The other man protected the myth. The myth matters because hip-hop is running out of shared gods. The genre is bigger than ever and smaller at the center. Every region has a hero. Every platform has a star. Every week has a new anthem and a new funeral. But Tupac still sits above the algorithm. Tupac still belongs to everybody and nobody. That is why the estate question is so explosive. If the culture accepts that Tupac can be used by anyone with a hard drive and a budget, then Tupac becomes a sample pack. If the culture decides Tupac can only be summoned with consent, care, and purpose, then Tupac remains a covenant. Rick Ross forced that decision into the open at the worst possible time for Rick Ross. Because 50 Cent has receipts in the imagination of the public. 50 Cent has the Eminem alliance. 50 Cent has the Drive Dre lineage. 50 Cent has the get rich or die try mythology. 50 Cent has a television empire. 50 Cent has a reputation for turning disrespect into infrastructure. Rick Ross has hits, wealth, aura, and a voice that can make a parking lot sound like a palace. But Rick Ross does not have custody of the sacred. On August 5th, Rick Ross acted like custody of the sacred was a punchline. That is the loss. Some fans will say Rick Ross won because Rick Ross trended first. That is a small scoreboard. Trending first is sugar. It hits fast and leaves the body empty. 50 Cent trended second and owned the meaning. The comment sections prove the difference. Under the Rick Ross clip, people argued about whether Rick Ross was wrong. Under the 50 Cent repost, people argue about whether the record could be historic. One debate centers Rick Ross. The other debate centers Tupac, Eminem, and the future of posthumous rap. The second debate is the one with gravity. The angle nobody wanted to say out loud is simple. Rick Ross was not really defending Tupac. Rick Ross was defending Rick Ross from the size of the moment. When a record feels bigger than the room, the insecure move is to shrink the record. Call the dead man dead. Call the tribute exploitation. Call the silence guilt. Make the sacred look silly, so the room stops feeling small. That is the hidden villain in this story. Not 50 Cent. Not the estate. Not even Rick Ross. The hidden villain is a part of the modern rap economy that teaches artists to treat every holy thing like a trend to be harvested before lunch. That economy rewards the fastest mouth, not the cleanest heart. That economy told Rick Ross the joke was the move. That economy told Rick Ross that a 30-year-old death could be used as a door to a week of engagement. That economy forgot that Tupac is not a door. Tupac is a wall with names written on the wall by people who are still alive because the music held them up. You do not spray paint a joke on that wall and call the joke bravery. You do not call the wall old because the wall has been standing for 30 years. The wall is the reason the house has not collapsed. Now the pressure moves to the record itself. If the Eminem and Tupac collaboration is lazy, 50 Cent will pay for this silence. If the verses feel stitched together with no soul, the purists will come back and say Rick Ross had a point wrapped in the wrong delivery. If the Shakur family is not centered, the backlash will return with teeth. That is the risk 50 Cent accepted by staying quiet. Silence raises the standard. Silence says the music will answer. Silence means the record cannot be average. A sacred teaser demands a sacred record. But if the record lands, Rick Ross becomes a footnote in somebody else's ceremony. That is the nightmare scenario for Rick Ross. Not a diss track, not a meme, a footnote. Rick Ross has spent years building a larger-than-life image, and nothing shrinks a larger-than-life image faster than being remembered as the person who joked while history was being carried into the room. The August 5th clip will always exist. The question is whether the clip becomes a warning or a punchline that aged into dust. The verdict is already forming. Rick Ross won the joke for a few hours. 50 Cent won the culture war by refusing to fight on Rick Ross terms. Tupac, 30 years gone, still set the terms for everybody. That should scare every artist watching. The dead can still crown the living. The dead can still expose the living. The dead can still make a billionaire look small and make a troll look disciplined. That is the power Rick Ross brushed against with smirk. That is the power 50 Cent saluted with silence. So the real question is not whether Rick Ross was allowed to say the sentence. Freedom is not the issue. The real question is what the sentence revealed. The sentence revealed that Rick Ross saw a sacred door and chose to knock with a joke. The sentence revealed that 50 Cent saw the same door and chose to stand aside so the names on the door could speak. The sentence revealed that hip-hop still has a line, even in 2026, even after every scandal, every stream farm, every label trick, every podcast hot take. The line is not perfect. The line is not always enforced. But the line is there, and Tupac is still standing on the other side of the line. Look at the pattern across the last 20 years. Every time an unreleased Tupac vocal surfaces, the same three questions follow. Did the family approve? Does the record honor the voice? Does the money reach the right hands? Those three questions are the difference between a tribute and a transaction. Rick Ross could have asked all three questions and looked like a statesman. Rick Ross chose instead to compress all three questions into one joke about a dead man clocking out. That compression is what the culture heard. The culture did not hear a critic. The culture heard a man laughing at a grave and calling the laughter honesty. And notice what Rick Ross did not say. Rick Ross did not say the estate cleared the vocals. Rick Ross did not say the estate blocked the vocals. Rick Ross did not claim inside knowledge of the session. Rick Ross offered zero information. Rick Ross offered only posture. That is the tell. When a person has real concern, the person brings details. When a person has real evidence, the person brings receipts. When a person has only a beef and a camera, the person brings a punchline. Rick Ross brought a punchline to a conversation that required paperwork, and the culture spotted the empty hands immediately. Now consider the Eminem factor, because the Eminem factor is the sleeping giant in this story. Eminem does not attach the Eminem name to Tupac casually. Eminem has spoken for decades about what Tupac meant to a kid from Detroit who needed proof that pain could become poetry. Eminem produced for Tupac before. Eminem treated those vocals like scripture. So when 50 Cent says an Eminem verse sits next to unreleased Tupac vocals, the informed fan hears something specific. The informed fan hears a chain of custody built on reverence. Rick Ross heard the same announcement and reached for a joke about rest. That gap in hearing is a whole story. One camp heard a ceremony. The other camp heard a target. There's also a generational split playing out under the comments, and the split matters. The older heads hear Rick Ross, and remember every time the industry sold a dead legend back to the fans at a markup. The younger fans hear Rick Ross and see a billionaire telling a ghost to clock out. Both groups arrive at the same destination from different roads. Both groups feel the disrespect before either group can articulate the disrespect. That is the thing about sacred names. The reaction is faster than the argument. The body knows before the brain writes the tweet. Rick Ross found that out in real time, and the speed of the backlash is the data point every artist should study. Watch how 50 Cent handled the hours after the joke, because the discipline is the lesson. No interview, no live stream, no story post with a caption full of laughing emojis. 50 Cent let the teaser carry the entire response, and that restraint did three things at once. First, the restraint kept the focus on Tupac and Eminem instead of on the feud. Second, the restraint made Rick Ross look like the only person performing. Third, the restraint signaled confidence in the record itself. Artists who trust the music do not chase hecklers. Artists who trust the music let the music walk into the room and let the hecklers explain themselves afterward. And the aftermath is already reshaping the board. Radio hosts who normally feed every Rick Ross clip went quiet. Playlist curators started framing the unreleased record as an event instead of a single. Commentators who spent years calling 50 Cent a troll suddenly found themselves calling 50 Cent a custodian. That is a total inversion of the usual script, and Rick Ross authored the inversion with one sentence. The lesson for every artist watching is brutal and simple. In a culture war, the person who makes the other side look respectful has already lost. Rick Ross made 50 Cent look like a monk guarding a cathedral. There's no comeback punchline for that image. The deeper question now belongs to fans. What is the culture owe the dead? Streams are easy. Tribute posts are easy. Anniversary hashtags are easy. The hard currency is protection. Protection means saying no when a brand wants a hologram to sell soda. Protection means asking who profits before asking who produced. Protection means treating unreleased vocals like instead of a warehouse. Rick Ross accidentally forced that conversation into the open, and even the critics of Rick Ross should admit the conversation is overdue. The tragedy is that the messenger buried the message under mockery, and now the culture has to dig the message out of the mud the messenger made. So here's where the story stands on August 9th. The teaser is still up. The comments are still climbing. The Shakur name is still the loudest name in the room, without a single living voice attached to the name. Rick Ross has a clip. 50 Cent has a frame. Tupac has a crown. And every artist with a vault, every estate with a hard drive, every label with a posthumous contract is watching this moment like a courtroom, because the verdict the culture reaches here will be cited in every future fight over every future legend. That is what Rick Ross really poked on August 5th. Not a rival, a precedent. Go back to the moment the teaser first dropped, because the teaser itself was engineered like a chess opening. 50 Cent did not announce the record with a date, a title, or a cover. 50 Cent announced the record with two names and a feeling. Tupac, Eminem. That is all the culture needed. The imagination did the rest. Fans started building the track in the fans' heads before a single second of audio moved. That is the highest form of marketing. The kind money cannot buy. The kind that only works when the names carry 30 years of weight. Rick Ross looked at that masterclass and answered with a drive-by joke. The contrast in craft is the story underneath the story. And understand what the silence from 50 Cent cost 50 Cent. Because silence is not free. Silence means letting the joke breathe for a full news cycle. Silence means watching the clip travel without correction. Silence means trusting that the names on the record are stronger than the noise around the record. Most artists cannot afford that trust. Most artists panic and start typing. 50 Cent has been in enough wars to know that the second move belongs to whoever refuses to move second. Rick Ross kept swinging at a man who had already left the ring and walked into the vault. By the time Rick Ross noticed the room was empty, the room had already chosen sides. There is a detail in the repost that deserves a full stop. No caption. Think about how hard that is for a man built on captions. 50 Cent built a second career on the caption, the joke under the photo, the knife hidden in a hashtag. For 50 Cent to post with no caption is like a storm refusing to thunder. The absence was a message. The absence said this record does not need the 50 Cent voice because the record carries the Tupac voice and the Eminem voice, and those two voices outrank everybody breathing. Rick Ross read that absence as weakness or as nothing at all. The culture read that absence is all. Same post. 2 readings. The reading with reverence 1. History will file this week under a strange category. The week of beef accidentally became a boundary. For years, the industry treated posthumous music like an open mine. Dig wherever. Sell whatever. Apologize never. August 5th put a fence around the mine, and the fence was not built by lawyers or by estates. The fence was built by millions of fans deciding in real time that a joke about Tupac resting was a joke told at the wrong altar. Rick Ross will recover. Rick Ross always recovers. But the fence will stay. And every artist who reaches for a dead legend name from now on will feel the fence before the fingers touch the wire. That is the real headline. Not the insult. The fence. And do not overlook the family dimension, because the family dimension is where this stops being content and starts being legacy. Tupac Shakur spent years guarding the Tupac name like a fortress, and the people who inherited that guard duty carry the same weight. Every posthumous decision lands on a kitchen table before the decision lands on a playlist. When Rick Ross joked about Tupac resting, the joke did not land on a brand. The joke landed on a family that has buried more than a rapper. The joke landed on cousins, on children of the movement, on a bloodline that still gets stopped in airports by strangers crying over verse 3 of a song recorded before some fans were born. That is the audience Rick Ross was performing for without knowing the audience was in the room. Sacred names travel with mourners. Always. The mourners heard the joke, and the mourners answer with a kind of silence that ends arguments instead of starting them. So what happens next decides everything. If the record drops and the record feels like a letter written Tupac instead of loan taken against Tupac, the culture will remember August 5th as a night the line got drawn. If the record drops and the record feels hollow, the culture will dig up the Rick Ross clip and admit the joke had a warning buried inside the disrespect. Either way, the standard is now public. Either way, the vault has new rules. Rick Ross spent one sentence trying to shrink a legend, and the legend grew a fence, a guard, and a verdict in response. That is the math of sacred names. The attack becomes the armor. The joke becomes the law. And the man who told the joke becomes the example every future artist studies before touching a ghost. Comment with one word. Guardian or Graverobber. Not for Rick Ross. Not for 50 Cent. For the record itself. If unreleased Tupac vocals meet an Eminem verse, and the result feels honest, call the record guardian. If the result feels like a cash machine wearing a halo, call the record Graverobber. Be honest. Because the culture is about to set a precedent that will follow every legend who left verses behind. Biggie is watching this precedent. Nipsey is watching this precedent. Every family with a lost voice and a hard drive is watching this precedent. And remember the date. August 5th, 2026. Not because Rick Ross made the timeline laugh. Because Rick Ross made the timeline choose. Choose between the joke and the covenant. Choose between the clip and the flame. Choose between a culture that eats its legends and a culture that still knows how to kneel when the right name enters the room. 50 Cent chose a flame. Rick Ross chose a clip. Tupac remains a flame. 30 years gone and still the loudest voice in any room the name enters. Still the name that turns a joke into a verdict and a teaser into a trial. Still the king of every room the name enters. Salute to the flame. Salute to the culture. Salute forevermore.